Hello and welcome to On the Record, a debate-style television talk show where Bahamians will find the balanced, true and open debate they've been looking for. The 2018-2019 budget was tabled last week, and the proverbial cards have been laid on the table. Those cards have dealt a hand of 50% taxation on gaming houses with revenues of more than $100 million. And the government has proposed taxing gaming customers through a 5% stamp tax applied on deposits and any non-online games or digital sales. This massive upswing has brought about loud and intense public outcry, some even saying it's a racial move. Demonstrators took to the streets this morning in protest, hoping to force government's hand to reconsider the new tax measures. Attorneys for the gaming industry say they are preparing to take the government to court. The government's chief lawyer, the Attorney General, says bring it on. And the Minister of Tourism says the government will not back down. We are gearing up for a Mexican standoff, and tonight we're going to take a closer look at the proposed tax hike and how this will affect Bahamians. Our topic is gaming versus government. All bets stand. Our guest is Marlon Johnson. He's the financial secretary of the Bahamas. Gershon Major, who's the CEO of the Bahamas Gaming Operators Association, had agreed to be our guest tonight, but cancelled just prior to the taping. But as they say, the show will go on. It's all on the record. I'm your host, Jerome Sawyer. Our discussion begins on the other side of this break.
Every time I'm in the Bahamas, I use Rev Go Play.
And cut.
Here come that fool. It's packing. Here he comes.
Yo.
Wait, Omar coming.
Boy, this Rev Go Play, solid.
Rev, you and us together.
Are you coughing, sneezing, having headaches, respiratory issues, allergies, or itchy skin? Toxic mold may be the problem. Clear Solutions Plus can help. Certified best in the Bahamas, specializing in mold removal, water damage restoration, AC duct cleaning, and more. Call Clear Solutions Plus to schedule an inspection for your home or office at 677-3138 or 427-3138. Open 7 days at the Mount Royal Plaza. Clear Solutions Plus certified mold removal. Visit our website. We are your solution to indoor air pollution.
And welcome back to On the Record. Gaming house revenues up to $20 million will be taxed at a rate of 20%. Revenues between $20 and $40 million taxed at a rate of 25%. Revenue between $40 million and $60 million taxed at a rate of 30%. And that is how the government's new tax hike will roll out in the gaming industry. Our topic tonight, gaming versus government, all bets stand. My guest, Marlon Johnson. As we said at the top of the show, Mr. Gershon Major of the Gaming Association had agreed to appear, but he cancelled his appearance on us at the very last minute. Marlon, welcome to the show. Good to have you on.
Good to be here.
I know that you've been sort of making the rounds, talking to a lot of folks about what is proposed in this particular budget, but certainly this issue with the taxation in the gaming industry seems to be one of the more contentious issues from the gaming operators, even the people who work in the industry, etc. I want to begin our discussion, though, with taking our audience back to how this really all began. About 2 weeks ago, as the budget was rolled out into Parliament, we had the minister on.
Right.
We asked him specifically what was the rationale behind these hikes. I want us to listen into what he had to say, and we'll begin our discussion after that. Let's take a look.
So some would argue that this is where the tax ought to be in the first instance. The minister responsible did a study where he determined that throughout the region and the world, our tax on gaming was the lowest. And so we have sought to rectify that, as well as we need to increase the revenue from that sector. We recognize that this sector has been lucrative. We recognize that there is some inequity that has correct or has been allowed in that industry, and we're trying to level the playing field a little bit so that the sector gives back as much as it takes.
But
based upon what we know, we believe that there's room without causing any hardship or very little hardship to this industry.
And thus began this entire discussion.
Right.
I want to talk, though, first about why government thought it necessary. I mean, we have heard the minister, but really let's go a little deeper into why it was necessary, what is necessary to tax the gaming operators when he speaks about inequity and even the lowest in the region.
Well, the broader context is the need for fiscal correction. Mm-hmm. It goes back really to the discussion that we're in a situation where we have and we have had for a long time a structural fiscal imbalance. We couple on, and by that I mean, for your listeners, it means that for years and years and years, the government has been spending more money than it takes in. Mm-hmm. We all have heard the term deficits, and we've all heard the term balance the budget. But the truth of the matter is, if you go back really since our early days of independence through now, we've generally ran deficits, and that's the structural element. On top of that, we have a substantial amount of old bills that we still have yet to pay. So the genesis of all of the tax reform that you see today presented by the government really stems from the fact that we have to fix this fiscal situation. As that exercise went on, the government looked to and see what opportunities there existed for additional taxes. By a large measure, the most significant tax increase is the VAT tax increase, which is expected to yield $400 million. The taxing on gaming was looked at in the context that what should a gaming industry, domestic gaming industry, yield for a state? If you look elsewhere around the world where there are state lotteries or where the government allows private lotteries, they are always taxed at a substantially higher rate than other businesses. And the rationale is that the government allows lotteries to persist with its social issues because they generate substantial revenues for the state. So again, looking at equity from a broad standpoint, the government has taken the policy position that instead of seeking to perhaps do its own version of a lottery, it would require of the industry writ large to contribute to the state in an equitable way consistent with how lotteries are treated elsewhere in the world.
Okay, so if we get back up for our views just a bit, what is the current rate right now at which gaming houses are taxed?
So gaming houses pay 11% on their what we call gross gaming revenue.
Okay, and what is that?
Gross gaming revenue is they look at the entirety of their games played. Mm-hmm. And you take out all of the winnings that they would have paid out. Now that number is a bit skewed, but I'll tell the audience what those numbers look like. Gross gaming revenue was around $3.4 billion during the last reporting period.
So how much?
3.4 billion.
In the Bahamas?
In the Bahamas. Now to be clear and transparent, because that's a misleading number in a certain way. That includes every time somebody spins and win, and then they play again, that's counted as a game played. Mm. So what happens is, of course, people have $20, they play 5, they win 10, and they play it again. So when you add all of that up, the gross gaming winnings is around $3.4 billion or thereabouts. The gross gaming payouts is around $3.2 billion. The net of that is the gross gaming revenue, which accounted again during the last reporting period for around $194 million, is the gross gaming payouts to the entire industry, of which they would then have to pay 11% under the current regime as it stands today.
And if you could explain then now why government thought to put in a sliding scale, which, if I'm not mistaken, means that you will pay according to what the monies you earn.
Right. So the way that the new proposal calls for to start at around 20%, mm-hmm. Which would cover, I think, 5 of the 7 operators that we have today. And then, of course, it scales up. There'll be one operator whose earnings, I think, was around $106 million, would top out. And that of that $106 million, if my numbers are correct, so that's $6 million of that would be taxed at the 50% rate on the other side of the scale. The reason that you apply a sliding scale is to create some sort of progression and progressiveness inside the system, so that you don't, and it normalizes out. So what I mean by normalizes out is that as a total, on average, the operators would pay around 25 or 26% on average. The biggest operator would end up paying around 33%. So that nobody's going to pay 50% of their earnings because of the sliding scale. And again, and that model is used by places like England. If you look at the British casino progression, they have one where I think over 10 million pounds is taxed at 50%. The government said 100 million at 50%. So this model is a model that's in use elsewhere.
Now, outright, the gaming operators have said, we cannot afford this. If this happens, we're going to have to close shop.
Right.
Some instances, we're going to have to lay some people off.
Right.
You would have heard the minister said that, you know, at the beginning, it's put in place, hopefully not to cause any undue hardship.
Right.
But they are saying,
right,
outright, this is going to cost us business.
Right. Well, their contention is that, listen, and it's true, if you tax us more, there's less money coming in. I mean, that's just simple arithmetic. Doing the analysis that had been done, even after tax, there are still substantial monies in the industry. So the government's view on the matter is that even in a post-tax agreement, these are still viable businesses which return an equitable rate of return to the owners, and in a way that's, again, comparable to other jurisdictions around the world. We didn't see any evidence in doing the analysis that any of them would have moved into a loss position, even after netting out what they have submitted as their expenses. They make less money, but it's still profitable in terms of a return on their equity and a return on their investments, not inconsistent with others around the world. Now, obviously, if you're a business and your tax bill has gone up, you now have a decision to see how do you protect your margin. If I was making, to use silly numbers, if I was making $3,000 a year on my business and now the government taxes me and I'm making $2,000 instead, now I have a determination, do I accept just making $2,000 or do I make internal adjustments to get me back closer to the $3,000? And I think when they're talking about the impact on their business is that you're right, like other businesses which face cost pressures, they may need to look to see how do they protect their margin and they protect their profitability, and they may look to consolidate. But with no consolidation, with no changing in their operations, even under the existing model, all of the operators still, from the analysis we did, are net positive.
So a couple of things. It would seem to me that jumping from 11 to a minimum of 20%, that seems pretty high.
Right.
That seems really high. I mean, you're talking a substantial amount, and then you're saying one operator could go as high as 35%. So why such a drastic increase, one? And secondly, if you're talking about impacting a business that, or an industry that employ so many people, and now they have to move to cost-cutting measures, that could mean unemployment. Is that not a danger now? Because you're talking about creating unemployment or affecting the unemployment numbers.
Well, again, that's a question for the policymakers, to be honest. But that said, the truth of the matter is, again, any measure that impacts a company's bottom line will require them to make some adjustments. We can't escape that particular reality. How they go about it is obviously under their remit and their efforts. Again, they're not in the other industries which for a number of reasons have had to do it. We've seen it in our retail banking industry. We've seen it in any number of industries. The way that they responded will be their decisions to make, obviously, and under their remit. As to the question as to why the government would have gone that route, that is a policy question. But I will say that the way in which the government would have approached it would be to see what measure of taxation would be appropriate for a gaming sector, given what the international experience is, and that would still leave them in a net positive position thereafter.
Now, you, Minister, and yourself would have mentioned a report that was done or a study that was done. Who would have initiated that? Where would that have come from? And the reason I'm asking is now because the gaming operators would have just put forth another study from two institutions, I think, that came up with a very different view. But I want to know where the government study came from. Well,
again, the minister responsible would be the one who does the analysis of the gaming industry, and he could speak a little bit more in depth to that. What they would do, as a matter of course, would be to send it to the Ministry of Finance for us to vet it and sort of take a look at it. So that question, respectfully, really got to be charged to the minister responsible. Our jobs at the Ministry of Finance would be to take it, to sort of take a look at the number and rationale and to see if there is justification in the numbers presented. I am aware, as the industry would have rightly pointed out, and the industry has been very open with the government and has presented the government with its report and its views of the world as to what is optimal. And again, truth be known, there is no single one answer. There's always different ways for any government or any industry to look at different things. So what the government has promised to do is to take a review of the reports, to take a look at it. But it is the position of the government that notwithstanding, that even with the taxation, the industry still remains viable, which I think is the core contention that the industry operators would have made. Yeah.
Just from an economic perspective, though, if you're talking about measures that would cause an industry to have to knowingly downsize,
right,
is that, though, not prohibitive to what you're trying to do in terms of, you talk about taxation and being fiscally prudent,
right,
but quite a few guests on the show have said, this budget doesn't speak to sort of growing the economy.
Right.
And this, to me, really speaks to shrinking an industry
right,
that puts out, by your own admission, billions of dollars a year.
Right. So the question then is really, from a Ministry of Finance perspective, we have to step back and look at it from a macro perspective.
Okay.
In looking at this industry in particular, to go back to the earlier point, the contention was, listen, after the new tax, what would be the net position of the industry and its operators? Would they still be in a position where they are profitable without having to make any adjustment? The answer to that, based on our analysis, is that yes, given the taxes on the patrons coming in and given the increased taxes, they would still be in a net profit position. They can and will, I imagine, decide to maintain their margin, their level of profitability, and which is, again, is fine, and they may make some internal adjustments. But the contention is that even with the tax measure, they still are in a net positive position. Now, broadly speaking, what the government is trying to do is to try to balance any number of interests. We have the fiscal situation that has to be contended with. We need sources of revenue. We looked to, as we look through it, we want to balance sort of the need of the economy. And of course, when we tax persons generally, broadly, that has an economic impact. We have a timing issue. We have the issue of just simply trying to raise sufficient monies to keep the government operating. The government's position is that the net impact of this, given that we are in a growth phase of the economy, is that the timing is best. It's a substantial correction in fiscal matters, but it is always optimal to make these corrections during a growth phase of an economy. And what that then allows, it maximizes the opportunities for people to be able to, as they're dislocated throughout the economy, to be able to find other opportunities. On top of that, to your point about the sort of growth agenda for the government, those will be encapsulated in the moves to the Small Business Development Fund to put capital and cash in the hands of small entrepreneurs who want to be able to grow their business. It's about the ease of doing business, to lower the costs for businesses to be able to actually get business done with the government and make life easier for them. It's in reducing the business license taxes for small Bahamian business hotels down to 0.75%, which is a substantial cut for them, about a 40% cut in there. So that gives them more cash to be able to expand their operations and do things. So there are a lot of elements in the budget that sort of been drowned out by all of this noise that are geared towards growing the economy and stimulating that kind of economic activity.
We're at the point of our first break in the show. We are taking a look at gaming versus the government. All bets stand. We were hoping to have a much broader conversation. The head of the Gaming Association agreed to come on, but he has not come on, and so we'll use this opportunity to talk a little bit more about the budget itself. Marlon Johnson is my guest. Stay with us. We are back right after this.
One America News Network, your leading source for the latest breaking national and international news. With nearly 4 times as many headlines as the other networks. Straight news, no speculation, no opinion, just the facts. Complete coverage 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. One America News Network, your source for credible news.
Betty Kelly.
Welcome back to More on the Record. As we said, there is a Mexican, or let's say a Bahamian standoff between the Bahamas government and operators of the gaming industry, and no one seems prepared to back down. Tonight, we're discussing gaming versus the government. All bets stand. Marlon Johnson, Financial Secretary, is my guest. We had a lot of questions for the Gaming Association, but our guest, who was scheduled to come on, did not appear. And so some of those questions I'm going to have to hold for another time. But we really began this discussion, Marlon, in earnest 2 weeks ago with the minister, who we heard from already and have been hearing from. But my guest last week had a very different perspective, or a very interesting perspective, I should say. We're going to listen in now to what our guest said last week and then pick up the discussion from there.
Well, I think I've heard the Minister of Finance making the rounds. He's been making the rounds on the talk show. And this most recent conversation this morning, he's justifying the fact that this move to impose this sliding scale tax, increasing the tax rate, I think, from some 10 or 11% up to a maximum of 50% now on a sliding scale, is justifiable because it's equitable. And it's I find it very difficult to accept what the minister is saying. And I think one of the challenges that I have with this position by the government is the fact that the government can just get up one day and say, I'm going to impose this level of taxation on a particular sector or industry. Now, in this instance, though, I believe that the Minister of Finance is playing on the emotions of the Bahamian people based upon what he perceives their view is toward gambling, based upon the gaming referendum, etc. But he's also saying that it's equitable because the amount of funds that this industry is bringing in, and in his words, what he perceives to be the impact it has on the social aspect of the Bahamian society, justifies the government's move in this place. But the other challenge that I have with his conclusion is the fact that he is using benchmarks from other countries, other jurisdictions like Monaco, like Miami. But what I found interesting about that was when questioned as to whether this scale of taxation was on lottery earnings, or was it just on gaming, or was it on casino-type gambling that the gaming operators engage in, he couldn't answer that. He said he would have to go back to the gaming board to confirm that, and that's concerning because you can have a case where you're comparing apples with oranges. And even more disturbing is the fact that you stand on the ground that this is equitable when the casino operators are not subject to the same level of taxation, and the only excuse you have as to why they would not be handled in the same manner that you're handling the gaming operators is because they have the protection of a heads of agreement.
Our guest from last week providing her insight. Rinthia Kumalafe is also the deputy leader of the DNA, but certainly bringing a very strong financial background. But she made some very strong points there. Right. The first one that really stood out to me, I think is a question that quite a few people have, is why are we taxing the casinos a little more?
All right, so, you know,
or a lot more.
I think the premise of the domestic gaming industry when it got started, it was started on the premise that they would be treated differently. You know, so if you look at the way that once the gaming industry was formalized and legalized, they started out from the premise that they would be taxed differently. So the treatment was always accepted. There wasn't an argument then. Their case would be a lot stronger if they objected then and said, listen, you bringing us in, we should have the same treatment as the hotels. It's kind of hard to make that argument now that the rates have changed when you didn't make the argument then, when you were still being treated unfairly. So that would be the first point. The second point to that is is an understanding of the role of casinos. Casinos in the Bahamas are there for foreign patrons where the money sort of comes in and the money leaves the country. It's an adjunct to the broader tourism industry. The benefit for having a casino is there is some marginal tax revenue, but the benefit principally is A, direct employment, and B, indirect employment because people who come to game also happen to stay. It's in a way, it's an attraction as part of an adjunct to our true trade, which is tourism. So, and because of that, successive governments have always granted them concessions because they attract the tourists who bring the foreign dollars. It's our export sector. So the starting premise for our export sector given its critical nature to the economy, is always different treatment. Now, one can argue whether or not that's right or wrong, but that is a founding principle upon which governments have agreed, including the gaming industry, because again, when they came to be, their argument ought to have been, I mean, if they want to have a consistent argument, that we ought to get the same treatment from day one. They already conceded that.
The issue was raised because it was at the very beginning. I mean, if you want to go back, there was always this question of, well, why can't we get into the casino business, or even why can't Bahamians gamble in a casino?
Right. So, and again, but that's been the justification. Now, the government at the time, and the government then at the time, take the position that, listen, you contribute more because it's you're using Bahamian dollars and Bahamian patrons, and for better or for worse, the impacts are domestic. Now again, we look at our domestic gaming industry, which impacts Bahamians, and we compare that to other jurisdictions where their citizens actually make use of the domestic industry, and there you will see the like-for-like equity in their treatment with what is proposed. Gaming around the world, when when citizens and people inside the country make use of those gaming facilities, pay a higher proportionate share of their take to the government as compared to other industries. The only other exceptions would be around liquor and cigarettes. And cigarettes in the Bahamas attract a 210% excise and customs duty, even with the Bahamian manufacturer of cigarettes. The Bahamian manufacturer of cigarettes, he pays 210% or has a 200% levy on his industry. My question would be, well, where the hue and cry for that? That's a differential treatment. Governments, again, and persons can argue whether that's right or wrong, but governments have made determination that certain industries, certain what we call the sin taxes, the vices, attract a higher rate of taxation than do other businesses. And you know that is sort of been standard government policy over successive governments.
Why, though, the taxation on the deposits as well? If I'm paying, I think it's 5% on my deposits into my gaming account. Why?
So the notion there was really gaming is entertainment. When you and I go to the movies, we have to pay VAT. If you and I go bowling, for instance, we have to pay VAT. If we go for a nice dinner, we have to pay VAT. Our entertainment, we pay a consumption tax. The issue with the nature of our gaming industry would have made it difficult for us to charge VAT on a spin. Because every time someone spins and they spin a 5-cent spin, the government would have had to charge VAT on that. So, and because most of it is electronic, and the lion's share of the electronic part is on spinning, which is a continuous activity. So the effort was, how do we apply a consumption tax on that entertainment most efficiently? And because they deposit and then play a range of games, that was the most efficient point. So the simple answer, it was our way of taxing the gaming on the consumption side, consistent with any other entertainment activity that any other Bahamian have to partake. So I could make the argument that me going to the movies, if the gaming don't have to pay a tax on their entertainment, why should I have to pay a tax on mine? So that's just a way of equalizing it out so that persons contribute. And the stamp tax would have been a lot more easier than let's say VAT, like in Barbados they charge VAT, but it's largely paper-based. If our industry was largely paper-based, then we could have gone to a VAT type arrangement. So that's the answer to that question.
Now, I guess my next question then becomes, you're looking at, I want to talk a little bit about sort of the overall tax hike that seems to, well, not seems, that is really causing a lot of people a lot of angst.
Yes.
Why the 12%? Why not a 10%, which is still being, gandered about and people are discussing? Why all the way up to a 12? Why not a gradual increase in VAT?
So that's a whole show unto itself, but we can start the discussion now. As this budget took shape, there was no pre-prescribed notion as to what the VAT rate ought to be, or any increase. Our starting premise, based on the government's policy direction, was how could we manage the government's finances without having to raise tax. That was the starting point. And that's important to mention because there's all sorts of conspiracy theories that the WTO or the IMF or the Illuminati require the government to have to raise the tax.
I didn't hear the Illuminati part. I've heard the others.
12%. Yeah. For some people, they're all part of the same continuum. But there's always been this derived that somebody opposed on us. No, there was no preconceived notion that the government had to move here. However, as it became clear, as the government went through the budget exercise and we looked through the budget exercise, even after cutting the budgets, because If you look at the budget, and persons can go online, certainly, and I invite them to, they will see that almost half of the budget agencies got less money this year than last year. So even after that exercise, there was still a $640 million hole, right? That was the extent of the hole. Based on the government's desire to get toward a fiscal balance, the fiscal deficit target was 1.8% of GDP, which turns out to be around $237 million. So that was the government's fiscal target, and that's what the government's budgeting this year for, a $237 million deficit. Even after that, Jerome, we still had a $400 million deficit to deal with. So, and why did we have a $400 million deficit to deal with? Not because of any massive expenditure hikes, but because we have $360 million worth of old bills that still had to be paid. These are bills that are due today. There was about $70 million worth of what we call right budgeting, meaning that these were budget items like school lunches, for instance, that was chronically under budgeted, that created any number of hardship to school vendors.
And the under budget would mean they were spending more.
Yeah, no, it was worse than that actually. Under budgeted mean that the budget was $2.5 million for a $4 million program. So obviously you see the problem with that, because when you get that, when you get that $2.5 million, the first thing is you got to, because this had been under budgeted for years, you got to pay off the old folks, and then you don't have enough money for the current plus the $1.5 million that you under budgeted. That's how we end up with $360 million in old bills. So we had that when you write budget for actual commitments. We had situations for government where things like the service fees for government's IT infrastructure wasn't budgeted. Wasn't budgeted. This
They weren't budgeted for IT services? So
costs, contractual services were not budgeted. Now, they were sort of put into the Ministry of Finance's computer vote or contingency vote. So, you know, and what happened at the bills come up, you sort of pay them, you go get what's called a contingencies warrant. And it was sort of a way to fudge the budget. So when you look at all of these true commitments and true cost of budget of the government, plus the arrears, plus the fact that all of our borrowing from the past has meant that in this year alone, our interest payment went up by near $90 million. So the $381 million of this budget is only to pay interest, and that's not principal. That's just interest, and that went up by $90 million. So when you add all of these things, elements, you realize that we have a serious and substantial problem. The government could have taken the position and could have gone to 10% because 10% seemed more palatable, but all that would have meant is that we would have had to borrow $400 million. And then when you borrow $400 million, your interest rates spike again, and you take in tax dollars only to pay interest. Anything less than 12% would have only postponed the problem, wouldn't have fixed it. And at some point, this day of reckoning would have come.
But seriously, are there no other sources of revenue? I mean, one of the greatest criticisms is people say that you can't tax your way out of debt. I think there's a sort of a Winston Churchill.
Yeah, you can't tax your way into prosperity.
Into prosperity. Right. Pardon me. I know I've seen it over and over.
Right.
But were there no other options available? And it's a question people keep asking.
Yeah, no, there's always other options available. There's several options. The government could have cut $400 million in spending. That's one option. They could have cut $400 million in spending. Now, again...
So what would that have meant? Let's use that.
If we use $400 million worth of spending, there's two ways you do that. You can cut real-life supplies that public servants need, meaning that you cut back on your travel, you cut back on...
So that's not a bad thing.
So, yeah, cut back on all of these things. But, again, once you do that now, you have a civil servant sitting in an office without office supplies, can't travel, don't have the tools to do their work. So, because, again, this is, again, under the understanding that there's already cutbacks. So remember now, the $400 million is on top of the cutbacks that are already in the budget, that are visible to all. So the only realistic way to have made the cut would have to be cut headcount. You can't cut headcount. You can't say, listen, we sent home 3,000 or 4,000 people, and now we close a substantial gap of that. So you could have taken the headcount reduction route. Doing that, of course, you put those persons on the unemployment line. You have the social services ramp up, there's the dislocation involved in that. And of course, there's the political element that nobody could deny, right? So the government said, listen, we'll try to preserve employment and to the extent possible and avoid that. So that's one approach. Secondly, we could have continued to borrow. We could have said we have sufficient headroom to borrow now, and we could have borrowed that $400 million on the understanding that, listen, we have $360 million worth of old bills. So bear with us. We're gonna borrow that. But you borrow those substantial sums, it goes back to the point I made earlier, you end up spiking your interest payments. And so now you create a hole, another $40, $50 million in, again, tax dollars that just goes to interest. And so that's $40, $50 million that you can't use.
You're paying to the, just so we're clear, so if you don't understand, you're paying interest does not mean that you are affecting the actual amount borrowed.
Absolutely. That principle, and that's what has happened for years, and it continues to happen. There's about $700 million and change of debt that we roll over every year, whatever the debt base is, because we need to get to a point where we have a balanced budget and start to run and keep it balanced so that we can start to pay down on the principal if we ever want to avoid the debt trap. So borrowing would have been an option. The option could have been to continue to ignore the arrears. You just don't list them, and you peck at them as they come up. And so you just leave them unfunded, and you kick the can down the road for another government at some point to address. So that would have been an option. We call that the head in the sand sort of approach, and that could have happened as well. But the responsible thing in the view of the government to do would be to say, listen, let's face it, that is the amount that is necessary. It puts us on a firm footing, and it really sets up the economy for medium and long-term sustainability and growth, and avoids the crash that we've seen in other jurisdictions.
We're going to take a break right here. I do want to talk about the potential impact on the economy, and based on some things people are saying. Even I'll use my own self, when we come back as an example. Stay with us. We were here to talk about government and the gaming industry, but we're going to use this opportunity to talk a little bit more about the budget. Stay with us. We're back right after this. We are in our second season of On the Record, and we thank you, our viewing audience, for allowing us into your homes every Thursday at 8 p.m. We value your opinion, and we want you to be a part of our discussions. So make sure you follow us on Facebook and Instagram and comment on our exciting topics. Remember, it's all on the record. And we are back with more On the Record. My guest tonight is Financial Secretary Marlon Johnson. Marlon, from my perspective, I have sort of been rationalizing and preparing for this increase in VAT, which is going to mean that I'm going to take home some less money. And I thought to myself, well, I'm going to cut back. I don't like to iron, so I send all my clothes to dry cleaning. So I'm thinking to myself, okay, I got to cut back. I got to wash now and get up a little early and iron 1 or 2 shirts. I'm not going to eat out anymore. I'm not anymore. I'm going to cut back. And I've started rationalizing in my mind some things that I'm going to do differently to put myself in a little better position. But then immediately, those things are going to impact businesses. That means I may not be taking as much money to the dry cleaners. I'm not going to be spending with restaurants and doing other things, and I'm going to cut back on my disposable income. The concern is, if everybody starts to, another significant amount of people do it, are we not now going to negatively impact the economy? Could we be headed for a recession if people stop spending?
So those are 2 questions, and they truly are separate. Will it impact the economy? Certainly. It's impossible to introduce a tax and take disposable income out of people's pockets and not expect to have some effect on consumption. Will it lead to recession? None of our economic models really suggest that it will lead to recession. Part of that is just good fortune, is that this is happening into the growth cycle, which again impacted the timing. If the country was in a recession or the economy would have been fluttering, the proper economic diagnosis would have been to say, listen, hold up on the tax increases, and do what successive governments have done at different times in the past. But
others have said that even the marginal growth that we have could be at risk.
So this gets me to my point. Right now, for 2018, the growth projections are around 2.4%, with a slightly higher for 2019. So what we anticipate is you may see some moderation in that. Now, moderating from 2.4% to say, let's say 2.0 or 1.9 is still positive growth, but the slowdown in the growth, I think, is reasonable to anticipate. So conservatively, the government anticipates some rollback. Interestingly, though, we have experience in this. We had the VAT, the initial VAT, which was a much bigger initial.
We went from nothing
to 7.5%. So that was a much bigger capture. And we saw what happened in 2015. In 2015, with the introduction of VAT on the first week of January, the economy actually improved year on year. The economy in 2015 improved year on year by 1.1%. So it went from negative 0.1% to 1% growth. So the economy actually improved with the introduction of VAT. Household expenditure actually grew marginally. It didn't grow by much, I think 0.4%, but it didn't also decline. So people say, well, that's kind of counterintuitive. Why would an economy grow if you take all this money out of it? Part of the reason is because when the government gets these increased receipts, it spends the money right away. And it spends the money back in the economy because, fortunately for us, we owed a lot of this money to our own vendors and our own selves. In other countries who face in this sort of situation when they make these significant adjustments, the tax receipts goes largely to pay off foreign debt. And so that money is pulled out of the economy. So the money, so yes, individuals, without question, will see their disposable income fall by some measure, but that will be mitigated by the fact that that money going into a government that will have to go and pay off these lunch vendors who will now have their money more timely and be able to conduct business in a more timely way. So yes, certainly.
Again, it comes to the question people are asking, if I'm going to be paying 12%, is there going to be a better accounting for that money? Will we as a public know? And I go back to the election slogan, where the VAT money going?
Right.
People are concerned about where this money will be spent, and will there be proper and true accountability?
So let me first say, one of the things that I am personally pleased about is that this announcement has made people pay attention. And what I mean, this is Citizen Marlon talking now. It's always a good thing, in my view, when people now start to pay attention to what their government is doing with their tax dollars. So that's an absolutely good thing. To your particular question, though, the answer is yes. In a few days, we will be publishing what's called the Citizen's Guide to the Budget. And that really is to take the budget and break it down into layman terms so people can understand and see. The government, the DPM has gone on record as saying that right now we only produce 2 reports, a midterm report and then a report at the end of the year, that will increase the quarterly budget. So that persons will get a chance to have a quarterly statement from the government. Most importantly, though, is that the government would have already circulated and intends to pass shortly the fiscal responsibility legislation. And what that will do, it will actually set deficit and debt targets and spending targets that the government has to enunciate. And it will create a fiscal council who will be able to get more of the detailed information from Ministry of Finance as an independent body to hold the government in check. To your point, the government has gone on record as saying it looks to create a balanced budget in 3 years. I think it understands that it has to deliver on that if it is asking us as citizens to dig into our pockets deeper. So, and the proof of the pudding will be, as this rolls out, if the citizens have more access to the information, if anything changes inter alia, is that communicated, and the success of government in taking the increased taxation and delivering on their promise to actually balance the budget.
One of the concerns, though, Marlon, is that you're talking about a 12% increase.
An increase to 12%, right?
Yeah, an increase to 12%. Sorry, not increase to 12% on items that or transactions we do every day, whether it's buying food, you go to the bank. I'm still annoyed when I take out $20, it tells me 7.5%.
Yeah, now that'll be 12%. Yeah. So even more.
So I can see that now, saying like $20, 12%.
Right.
But the concern really is for the poor.
Right.
In this budget, you are looking to remove VAT from some breadbasket items.
Right.
But again, the criticism is that is going to be lost in the increases on everything else. The poor, those living at below the poverty line, seem to be most at risk because, you say you've reduced items, you've removed VAT on those breadbasket items, but, that's a small... That is a small list of things that we need to live off of every day.
Right.
So I want to talk, about the concern and what is the safety net for the poor out there who are screaming bloody murder at this point. That everything is going to go up.
No, it is an absolute valid point, Jerome. Clearly, if you look at old age pensions on a fixed income. If you look at persons who are truly poor and marginalized, they're either underemployed or unemployed. Or persons, even if they have a good job, who've been struggling because this is an expensive place to live. That is the impetus for the government actually fulfilling, or whatever their plans were, certainly to making sure that It actually provided the breadbasket relief, provided the electricity relief, it provided the relief on water. It's not to say that the poor now don't have to pay more, because certainly when you net it out, they still have to pay more in many instances. But it's to try to mitigate that impact as much as possible. So I think, you know, those of us who, as technocrats, have to accept the reality that yes, the poor will be impacted and have to pay more, as will the middle class, as will all Bahamians really who consume anything in the society. However, had the government not taken the mid-term tough pill, the net impact of this, had it prolonged it, had we stayed on this trajectory, 4 consecutive downgrades, the country already has junk bond status credit rating agency. And that only, just not as embarrassing, but it actually impacts our tax dollars, because the worse your rating gets, the more expensive it is for you to borrow money. And the more expensive it is for you to borrow money, meaning the higher your interest rate, the more your tax dollars got to go back to pay back the debt. Had the government not taken this medium term or this sort of corrective action now, the medicine would have been a lot worse down the road. And again, we don't have to go far to see what happens when a government waits too long. Then we wouldn't be talking about at 12%. We'd be talking about close to what our neighbors pay, around the region of 18%, 16%. We'd be looking at personal income tax. We'd be looking at any number of things to correct it. And that's a bitter pill to accept. And over the real long term, although our foreign currency reserves are healthy and expected to stay healthy, if that really becomes prolonged over time, and I want to be clear on this because I don't want it to be said that I'm suggesting that our currency is at risk. It is not. But again, over time, if you take the long view and you don't take the corrective actions, you do get to a point where you start to put your currency valuation at risk. We're not there yet, so I don't want it to be I don't want to be misquoted on that. But the prudent thing in the view of the government, and the view of those of us who advise the government, is to take the Buckleys now to avoid the really, really horrible potential surgical procedure down the road that could even be much more worse and damaging to the poor.
Have you though considered that you may have now more people relying on social services and food assistance and the kind and those social services programs? Have you taken that into effect?
Yeah. So the budget, one of the areas where there has been an increase is in social services in the budget. So I think net terms they've increased by about $4 million in anticipation that there would be some dislocation here. The way ultimately, and you alluded to it earlier, is around the government's plans for job creation. Again, monies for small businesses, because small businesses more than governments actually create jobs. You get the hands of the entrepreneurs, they'll create the jobs. Fortunately for us, we're in a growth trajectory, so the pipeline of foreign investment is healthy, is again reducing the barriers for businesses to be able to expand their business. The long-term success is getting people employed and employed in better jobs. So that prognosis, and the more jobs you create generally, the more pressure it puts on wage upward, because of course there's more competition for labor there. And you start to see some of that dynamic even in the major resorts, because we now have 2 major resorts in New Providence. There's wage competition.
You don't think this increase will impact? I mean, if I'm a businessman and my costs are going up, don't you think that will impact wages?
I think, well, the good news about VAT, which is the most significant, is that it's a pass-through for business, so it really doesn't drive their cost. It impacts business because people spend less. So that, again, is a concern and consideration. But again, the good news is that we've had the experience with the first VAT increase. And despite, again, similar prognosis that the economy was going to collapse, it wasn't long ago. Mm-hmm. And we remember that we had the VAT songs, the very cleverly done VAT songs. We had the prognosis that we were going to become an economic basket case because of that. It happened, saw a little sort of moderation, and persons adjust. So my prognosis, and I know this may come back to haunt me, but I'll say it anyway, is that although we may see some moderation in our economic growth in the near term, I think very quickly the economy will adapt, and that the impacts, although they will be done, we will be able to absorb it and move on. And as the IDB said in 2013 when it was looking at VAT the first time, and this is what I encourage Bahamians to look at. There's short-term pain for long-term gain. It's like you working out. It's like you getting better. There may be some adjustments you have to do now. When you first start to work out, it's horrible. It's horrible. But the long-term impacts is what matters. It's changing your diet. It's starting to work out. It's changing your financial habits. There are always difficult transitions that you have to do. But again, the longer we delay this, for all the reasons that we spoke about earlier, there's no way to get around this. There's no way to grow ourselves out of these structural situations. We have to, at some point, accept the reality that we make the difficult decisions and we move on. But I also want to draw your attention to the other element of the government's commitment, and that is that after the arrears are paid off and paid down, because some of this is to deal with the arrears, the government has gone on record to committing to start to lower the customs duties and excise taxes.
I want to put a pin in that because that's what I want to discuss. We've got to take a break,
right.
But I want to talk about customs duties, some of the decreases we've seen,
right.
And why more decreases are necessary in the future.
Okay.
Stay with us. We've got one final segment. We're going to be back on the record right after this.
It's a wealth of entertainment with a touch of class and sophistication. A journey of the senses with an unparalleled sense of style. Discover hidden adventures that are cradled in the palms of paradise. Traverse the annals of human history and explore the farthest reaches of exclusivity. It's an excursion that few can afford, but all should experience. And it's only on AWE.
Welcome back. This is our final episode of this edition of On the Record. Tonight, our topic is gaming versus government. All bets stand. We started off certainly talking about the new tax measures for the gaming industry. One of our guests, the CEO of the Bahamas Gaming Operators Association, did not show up tonight. So we have obviously had to shift that discussion because I had quite a bit of questions for him, but at some point, hopefully, he'll come on. Marlon, one of the things that we were discussing as we went into the break was this whole issue of customs duties and some of the duties that have been reduced, even removed. And in the very first discussion I had with the minister and the deputy prime minister, he talked about that being, I guess, one of the countermeasures to try and offset what was happening with the VAT. But I want to talk a little bit about, you know, the rationale behind trying to reduce some of those duties and how realistic, particularly when you look at, you know, the removal of duties on planes and helicopters, and people going, well, what could possibly be the rationale? But, you know, as much as I'd love to own a plane.
Yeah, that isn't for me. Right. I want you to come back and hold that discussion about the planes and helicopters, because it is worth addressing for sure. It's important. But as I've said elsewhere, one of our little hidden realities in the Bahamas is that we are focused in on the VAT, and the VAT moving to 12% from 7%. And there's a very visceral reaction to the VAT, whether they're talking about where the VAT money gone, or how you're spending my VAT, or why you're increasing my VAT. Interestingly though, our biggest contributor to high cost of living isn't VAT. It's the high custom duty regime we have, which averages at 30%. And to my mind, and this is just me playing armchair sort of psychiatrist here, or psychologist, we don't see those taxes, so we don't think about them. And I've often joked, it really would be a different conversation if on your receipt you see that 30% customs duties, or 65% for a car, or what used to be 45% for tiles. You see that as just things being expensive in the Bahamas and not as a key contributor to our cost of living. And that really has skewed our economy and driven our cost of living highly, but we don't pay attention to those taxes. Nobody has ever come to me yet and said, why y'all don't reduce the customs duties? They have said, why y'all don't reduce the VAT? And if we want to really address the cost of living, we have to look at our customs duties and excise tax. And it is for that reason that the government would have said that once the arrears have been paid off and the situation is stabilized, it has committed to at least cutting customs and excise by a minimum of $100 million a year. And That would,
That's a lot of money.
Yeah, that would allow, though, the government to reduce custom duties in some key things which drive the cost of living in the Bahamas. Because it is sort of the unseen elephant. It is the one that's contributed where we pay a lot of taxes out, but we don't feel it as much because we don't see it.
Buy a new car.
Right? Exactly. Buy a new car.
Yeah,
and this is what has led the government to, even in that count, of at least creating some opportunities by lowering the duties on cost-efficient vehicles to allow Bahamians to be able to once again afford a new car. So I think what I would really invite and encourage your listeners and your viewers to do is to take a look and see how custom duties is impacting their cost of living and ensure that they keep the feet to the fire of the government to address that over time, because that is the major contributor to cost of living.
One of the reasons, though, I know that we almost are being forced to address that is the ascension to the WTO,
right,
which is inevitable. And I want to talk very briefly about why it's important for us to address those.
Right. So one of the sort of theories going around time is that, well, the government is doing this thing because of the WTO. Is it moving to 12% and that the WTO is driving this? Let me say again categorically, with no fear of anybody contradicting me, that this has nothing to do with the WTO. That said, it is absolutely true that the government is on track to ascend to the WTO in 2019, and part of that negotiation...
That's next year.
Yeah, that's next year. And part of that negotiation will mean that the WTO will require us over time to reduce our customs duties.
And why is that? So that people understand, once you join into the WTO, why do you have to reduce and remove these customs duties?
Well, first of all, I just want to make sure people understand, because this is another misunderstanding, that you don't have to remove them. Mm-hmm. What the WTO requires is something called equal treatment. Right. And that it's a principle that, first of all, you need to remove customs duties and tariffs when they create real barriers to trade. And what do I mean by that? If, for instance, you have let's say you in a country where you produce pigs, you have a big pig industry, and you have all your customs duties for all your meats at 30%, but for anything for bacon and pork, you have it at 50%. Well, that's a barrier to entry. So in the first instance, they'll ask you to bring that down to make it normalized with meat, or to do something called an income quota, an import quota, and that's a little bit more complex. But it's that, first of all, you need to have fair treatment. And they will give you a transitional period. So that there will be, it's unlikely that there will be any negotiation, I don't know how it will turn out, which will require us in 2020 to have to drop all our customs duty stacks. That said, though, the rationale of the WTO is that customs duties and taxes are barriers to trade. And by being barriers to trade, they add to the cost of living for citizens, and they stop economic and stifle economic growth and development.
We'll have another discussion on WTO at another time. Right. But one of the things that struck me in this whole exercise is that yourself and the minister responsible for finance have been going around and having town meetings, facing into various groups. Even on social media, you would see explanations for certain things. That seems to be a very deliberate move to bring this process to the people, if I could use that term.
That's correct. And I think you're going to see more of it. In fact, I've gotten into hot water personally for doing so. And the question is really the propriety of me as the financial secretary going out. One of the things I pointed is that this is a new and novel. Both former financial secretaries have gone out during the development of VAT and certainly in other fora and spoken to government's policies in any given area. I don't think that's unusual, because our positions are to express the government's position and not to advocate necessarily our personal positions, which may or may not line up to that.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because you were accused of that in the House of Assembly. The opposition leader says that you've been engaging in political rhetoric, speaking specifically to your comments on social media.
Right, and again, if they would look through it, they would see that what I do is I seek to explain and expound upon the government's position. These are my positions. If I, in a public forum, I speak to express the government's position and to explain. Largely, people appreciate that. They appreciate being able to engage me or engage others and speak to that. Outside of that, though, the government, we would have set up a Ministry of Finance page, and it is part of the DPM, the Deputy Prime Minister's view, that we have to do a better job of educating people about the budget and giving them opportunities to answer questions and to get past just the discussion on tax. If you notice tonight, our discussion about the budget has largely been about the impacts of the taxes, the gaming tax.
But there's so much more.
But there's so much more elements to the budget. And our concern is, from a Ministry of Finance standpoint, his policy concern is that there are a lot of opportunities in there for Bahamians, whether it's free BTVI education, whether it's the access to small loans, whether it's the Prime Minister's cultural grant, whether it's the fact that we have free duty on clothes and shoes for licensed merchants. Whether you're a big merchant or a small merchant, you'll be able to apply and bring in clothes and shoes and apparel duty free. That will also lower the cost of living for Bahamians. There's any number of things in there that speak to a broader plan to address some of the concerns around cost of living and also spurring the economy.
As wonderful as that may be on the surface, and I'm happy that you are doing that because that's important.
Right.
But was there an anticipation of this kind of fallout? And if so, shouldn't there have been a contingency to deal with it a little better? I mean, to push those other items within the budget that you speak to,
right.
that could possibly benefit other sectors and benefit even the larger population.
Well, on that, one of the interesting things is as the minister was going through the budget, he was speaking, because of course he spoke to these things before he spoke to the increase in the taxes, and people were listening. But the minute you get to the fact that now the tax got
everything else drowned out.
Then everything else drowned out. And that said, though, the efforts by the Ministry of Finance's communication team, who I have to commend on social media, sending out the infographics, and I've already seen people understanding more. People who were violently against the tax increase when it have come out and said, well, okay, due to the explanations, we understand it better. We still ain't quite happy that we have to do this, and nobody's happy to have to pay more tax. But those efforts have led for people, first of all, to sort of appreciate why such a move would be necessary. And even if they disagree they still disagree with it, which is fine. They at least have an explanation for it. And the BTVI, speaking to the president there, Mr. Robertson, he tells me of the number of calls and inquiries they've gotten, because people are now who have been out of school for a while or who were going to school are really interested in the fact that BTVI will now be offering free scholarship tuition, and it will now give persons training to not only just to get a job, but to get out in business on their own. So the messages are filtering through, and I think at the end of the day, all things being equal, in time, even those who disagree would appreciate why such a move is important.
Well, I do have to say that I do want to applaud you and the team for going that route. I mean, it's important. We don't all exist in the same space, and I say this all the time, but social media is an active avenue for us to reach out to people and to talk. I mean, President Donald Trump talks to the world through Twitter.
Right. So, maybe that is a good example.
Not that that's the best example, but I do understand what it is that you're trying to do, and I think that at some point people will appreciate the fact that you are facing into the public when it is a difficult conversation, and that's what I try to get people to understand. That even when it's difficult, you still have to talk.
Right. Absolutely.
And as you said, it's okay to disagree, but at least people now have the information. So I applaud you on that. You all have a yeoman's job. Whenever you're talking about budget, it's one thing, but tax increases, it's a very difficult pill to swallow under any circumstances. But Marlon, thank you for coming on.
Thank you very much.
And providing us with some great information and some insight. Like I said, I would have liked to have had our other guests on today. Gershon Major, if you're listening, you owe me a show. But again, thank you for coming on tonight. We hope that you've enjoyed our show tonight. A special announcement before we go. Happy 54th anniversary. Worthy matron Tanya Smith Cartwright, who is my producer here at the show, and to her Rebecca Chapter, number 4, Order of the Eastern Star, Prince Hall affiliated. Congratulations, Tanya, for holding it down with your sisters in the chapter. All the best to you as you celebrate your 54th anniversary. Thank you so very much. Maybe at some point on the record we're going to talk about lodges and what goes on in those wonderful meetings. Tanya, that's a call to you. Hope you've enjoyed our show tonight. Special thanks to Marlon Johnson, my producer, technical staff, and of course your audience for watching each night. We'll see you for more On the Record next week, same time, same place. Once again, I'm your host, Jerome Sawyer. We'll see you next time.